اقتصادي متميز جدا. هو من الناس اللي زارت مصر أكتر من مرة، وهو كان موجود في الحكومة البريطانية في أكثر من موقع وفي أكثر من وزارة، فعلى دراية باللي بيحصل النهاردة وعلى دراية بتاريخ مصر، وعلى الأقل التاريخ الحديث هو على دراية بيه بشكل تام. فنعرف منه برضو موضوعات مهمة جدا تتعلق بالاقتصاد. يعني ازاي بريطانيا شايفة انها ممكن تساعد مصر، مش من وجهة نظر الحكومة ولكن من وجهة نظر البرلمانيين واللوردات وغيرهم اللي موجودين، ازاي يكون في دعم لمصر يعود بالنفع اكيد على بريطانيا بشكل من الاشكال، لاننا مش لازم نتوقع ابدا ان في حد هيبقى جاي يدعمنا عشان سواد عينينا. مصر تقدر تقدم الكثير لبريطانيا، لأوروبا، للعالم كله. فنفهم وجهة النظر البريطانية من لورد هاول of Guildford.
The Honourable Lord Howell of Guildford, first of all, let me welcome you to Cairo and to Cairo 360.
Thank you.
How was your trip so far?
Very, very interesting. Of course, very full. Never enough time. But I am very impressed by many things that I've seen and very full of hope for the future.
Let me ask you, in your capacity as an economist, of course right now Egypt is trying to rebuild its economy. What sense did you get of what Egypt needs in the coming period?
Well, it needs thus to settle down politically. That is a condition in which enterprise can recover. It probably needs support internationally for capital needs and infrastructure. It needs to develop its energy resources. Egypt is very rich in energy, and yet you're having to import energy from, I think, gas from Israel and maybe even some oil as well. That's wrong. You should be able to develop your resources really effectively. And then, of course, we want the tourists back, who will come back as soon as they feel the situation is settled. And you've got important new manufacturing to develop, modern manufacturing, which includes a lot of knowledge and high technology in it to bring young people in. And of course, above all, you need your educational system to roll forward and create a good cadre of skilled and talented people.
And when we say that the political situation needs to settle down, that means that something needs to happen. And at this present stage, you may have felt some kind of polarization still in Egypt, or has this changed from your perception before you visited Egypt?
Well, I don't know, and nobody knows. I mean, what we do is hope, because we admire and respect Egypt and we want to see it prosper. Clearly there has been a settlement as far as the presidential elections are concerned. Now the move goes forward to a parliamentary structure which will evolve. It won't be perfect to start with. We spent several hundred years in Britain struggling with our parliaments, so it will take time. But it seems to me there is a map, a pathway, and there is a willingness to follow it. But of course I can't guarantee if things go wrong, there may be more disturbances. We have them all over the world, so Egypt won't be free from some degree of challenge. The path won't be smooth, but it's there.
When you were first invited to come for this visit to Cairo, what was your first impression upon the invitation? Why would I go to such a troublous place, or it's good to be there, or it's good to know?
Well, I'm very much concerned and have been for many years in energy and economic issues. I used to be the UK Secretary of State for Energy at one stage. And energy, although people don't understand all the complexities, is actually vital. It's the oxygen for societies. Second, I've spent a lot of time in this region, and I have a spokesman for foreign affairs in the House of Lords, upper house, for 10 years, and I've recently been a minister in the Foreign Office as well. So I follow the affairs of the region very closely. Thirdly, a lot is happening in this region, some of it very worrying. We've heard the news from Mosul, northern Iraq. The Syria situation is still terrible. There are refugees all over the Middle East. And
we tend to forget Libya when we
yes, Libya next door is causing troubles. So we look increasingly to Egypt as the rock of stability, the rock of a much largest influence in the area. Egypt must go right. If Egypt goes right, the region will stabilize. If Egypt had continued with its past difficulties, there would be more instability all round. So I come here with a lot of hope and a lot of passion, really, that Egypt should prosper.
I sense a lot of wisdom in what you're saying, but do you think Western governments do have this wisdom as well, or it's going to take a bit of time because they don't have that much experience as you do?
Well, Western governments come in different sizes, and Western governments have certainly made mistakes. There is a need throughout Western governments to adjust their minds to the facts of the 21st century, which is that the Western hegemony no longer exists. The power and the central gravity, both economic and political, has moved. It's dispersed partly to the rich areas of near Asia and the Middle East, where we are now, and into the rising powers of distant Asia, that's Japan and China and Korea and so on. But even more, it is dispersed to the people. The electronic revolution has given us 7 billion mobile telephones, 2.5 billion people every morning go onto the World Wide Web. This is knowledge is power. This has given power to the people everywhere, and everywhere governments have to bend a bit. They have to give leadership, but they also have to respond, and this is a new challenge.
And that's one term I haven't heard in many, many years, hegemony. But I do sense, I mean, that we tended to forget that term, even though it's being applied most of the time. I mean, we, especially when I see what's happening in Iraq, for example, I could see that there is Western hegemony that has failed big time over there.
Yes. I think, you see, once we get out of the idea that the West is superior and the West leads the world and all that sort of thing, get into the idea that we all have to learn from each other, that the world is now a network. It's not a, if I may use a local term, it's not a pyramid or a hierarchy with bosses on top. I don't believe this is a world of superpowers anymore. This is a world of networks, and in this network there will be important players like Egypt, there will be important players possibly like Iran, possibly like Saudi Arabia, possibly like Turkey. These will have a major influence in shaping the region. I think what you call the West, the European power, Britain, have to and possibly even more America, have to understand that we come here to support, not to lecture and impose our own values and so on. We've got our own values, but you've got yours as well, and we have to have a proper dialogue.
They must meet somewhere, these values, because human values are somewhere, there's a common ground amongst them all.
Yes, there is, and therefore it's not, people say, what about British values, American values? They're everybody's values, you're quite right. What I think is important for a nation like mine, Britain, is our purpose and direction and what we want to contribute to the world order. We don't want to be, and no nation wants to be or can be isolated. In a network you can't be, or connected to everybody else. And problems in one part of the network immediately transmit through the network lattice work to other nations. So it's in our interest, sitting up there in Europe, to contribute, to support as best we can to maintain political stability. And in Iraq it's not been very successful, as you rightly said. There are other, in Syria it's been not at all successful. But as far as the rest of the Middle East is concerned, and Libya, I don't think the thing is quite as bad as people fear, but they're not very good. But we must offer our support and our experience and our skill, and as far as we've got them, our resources and our training, which of course we do.
As a British citizen, and with all the values that you have, and you were telling me just before we started recording that the first time you visited Egypt was back in 1962. So you know the place, you know what it looked like, you know what it looks like, and so on. How do you feel as a British citizen when Islamic extremists take over the region? Wouldn't that, give you goosebumps at least?
Well, I think it's if extremism of any kind, and certainly was to take over a large region, it would be. I think the essence of the kind of democracy we've tried to develop in Britain over several hundred years is always in favor of moderation and resist extremism of either side. We saw how Europe was engulfed, slaughtered by a right-wing fascist extremism.
Right.
We saw how the old communist empire imposed an extremism of a so-called left-wing kind. In fact, they both ended up being rather right-wing. So extremism is the enemy. And if we see it, we should stand on our guard and try and reinforce the moderate forces wherever we find them. And the moderate forces that are trying to develop a good democratic base, trying to build up a parliamentary system as you're doing here. You have plans to move to that. That's what we must support against the extremists.
And do you sense or feel that the British government's endeavor to investigate the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood in Britain, do you sense that it is a serious endeavor, or as some people may say, this is just, you know, in order to say we've done it and that's it?
Well, I think it will be useful. It's a very experienced person in charge who I know personally. And I think it will be a useful addition to our knowledge. And the more we can bring these things into the daylight and make them transparent, the more we can push away the dark fears and extreme statements which are often based on complete ignorance. So I think it's useful. I wouldn't say it's the solution to everything, but it's useful.
You said you know the person in charge, that is the Ambassador Jenkins?
Yes.
You know him personally?
Yes.
And what are your impressions, especially
He's a very able man.
He came under such a great attack by British people, by, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, even though we've heard from the Saudis that he's a very fair person.
Well, these may be media reactions, but the reality is you're dealing with a very able, enormously experienced man who understands, and as far as any of us in Britain fully understand them, at least he is certainly one of them. So I think he can be we can have full confidence in him.
Right. One final question. You've attended the meeting with the President Sisi, and he spoke about human rights and values, and he added to the human rights what we normally talk about in terms of freedom and freedom of expression and so on. He added to these the economic rights.
Yes.
What do you think of adding these values of economic rights like good living, education and health and so on, where we are asking the Western governments to come in and help as well?
Well, I think these things are all connected by a sort of golden thread. That's an expression the British Prime Minister has used. Values and trust and the feeling that matters are going to be handled with the rule of law and good governance go hand in hand with investment and business and prosperity and wealth creation. They can't be separated. Mm-hmm. If you try to separate them, the trust breaks down and the economy does not develop. So I think your President al-Sisi is correct that these things are connected and have to be pursued on all fronts. Very difficult, but they have to be, and it's a constant need, as I think the President mentioned to us, for finding the right balance.
The Honourable Lord Howell of Guildford, it's been a pleasure, and on behalf of all regular Egyptian citizens like myself, I thank you for taking the efforts and the pains of coming to Cairo to support us in a way of at least conveying to Britain how we feel and how we think.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Thank you.
هذا البرنامج برعاية
نحن هنا نفضح هذه الأكاذيب.
بعد زلزال الصندوق الأسود
نحن نكشف خرائط CIA في مصر.
عبد الرحيم علي في رمضان زلزال جديد. احبسوا أنفسكم من الآن وانتظرونا على شاشة القاهرة والناس حصريا في رمضان.
برنامج جديد هقدمه لكم في رمضان، هنكشف فيه عبر 30 حلقة كل اللي حصل خلف الغرف المغلقة
وما خفي كان أفزع.
هنقول ونعرض ونسمع مع بعض شهادات طنطاوي ومراد موافي وعمر سليمان عن مصر في 3 سنين. كل اتفاق وكل كلمة جرت خلف الغرف المغلقة سنذيعها هنا.
ومحاكمة علنية وعلى رأسهم أنا وأنت يا جمال.
الحساب جاي. هذا البرنامج برعاية
لورد جيفري ديل خبرته كبيرة جدا في مجال الأمن وفي مجال مكافحة الإرهاب، وكان لقاؤه مع وزير الدفاع الفريق صدقي صبحي مهم جدا، وسمع للفريق صدقي صبحي في هذا اللقاء الكثير، وسمع له أيضا وزير الدفاع. انطباعاته مش بس عن مصر، انطباعاته أيضا عن بلاد تانية في المنطقة، عن الوضع الأمني اللي موجود حوالينا. في نفس الوقت زي ما حضراتكم برضو عارفين ان الوفد اللي موجود ما جاش بس زار الحكومة، ده يمكن قبل ما يلتقي بالرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي كان بيلتقي بالمجلس القومي لحقوق الإنسان، كان عنده لقاءات مع السيد عمرو موسى، كان عنده لقاءات مع دبلوماسيين مختلفين. فالصورة اللي هم بيكونوها مش مجرد صورة من رئيس دولة ومن وزراء الدولة، لا، الصورة بيكونوها من أطراف مختلفة ومتعددة. تعالوا نشوف لورد جيفري دير. The Honorable Lord Jeffrey Deer, it's a pleasure to host you on Cairo 360.
It's so much a pleasure to be here, thank you. My first visit to Egypt, and I've enjoyed it immensely. Far too short.
It is the first visit to Egypt?
Yes.
Okay. And that surprises me a bit because you are an expert on a number of security issues, and a lot of things have been happening in Egypt and around Egypt when it comes to security. So how come it's your first visit?
Well, life has taken me all over the world, at least to America, of course, many of the countries in Europe, the Middle East, India, but never to Egypt. But I know quite a lot at second hand about the Egyptian situation, and I hope to be able to help in the future.
Let me start by asking you, before asking about the visit and your meeting with the President and the Defense Minister and others, but let me ask you about how do you see this security issue happening around the Middle East these days?
Well, the Middle East is very fragile, as you know. It is split. Economically, it's split on religious grounds. Ideology is getting in the way, I think, of common sense in many ways. With common sense, I think the leaders can pull themselves and their countries out of it. But without common sense, I think there are real dangers. And one sees, of course, what is happening quite recently in the last few days in northern Iraq as one example of many. The problems go back a long way.
And how do you see it, I mean, in terms of this, the Muslim extremists taking over many countries, or at least they are trying to disrupt the regimes in different countries? How do you see it?
Well, again, I use the words again. It's creating a very fragile situation. I mean, the Western media frequently uses the word Muslim too widely. I mean, there are so many hundreds of thousands, millions of very sensible, deeply religious, committed Muslims who are no threat to society at all, either their own society or anyone else. And the numbers of extremists are relatively small. But the damage that those few can do to their own country or to other countries, of course, is quite profound. And it is a matter of, I think, bringing common sense to bear, a question of hearts and minds, perhaps internally and externally, to lead to a situation where people can live together with tolerance rather than with hostility.
But why is Britain not concerned about the Middle East, which is the backyard of Europe?
Oh, I would argue against that. I think Britain is very concerned about the Middle East. I mean, who cannot be? The Middle East is a pivotal part of the world. It sits, by definition, between Europe and Africa, the Far East and America. It's almost a crossroads of the world, and always has been historically. And so, if the impression is being gained that Britain is not concerned, I would disabuse that. I think it is Britain is very concerned.
Concerned in terms of seeing the danger looming from these movements, from these small groups, as small as they are, but still they're very effective?
Looming perhaps is the wrong word, but certainly there is a danger. We've seen that, and it would be foolish to ignore that. The dangers are well known, that small numbers of very determined people, with or without arms in their hands, but often with arms in their hands, and explosives as well, can wreak terrible damage. And the terrible thing is, of course, that having done what they're going to do, they don't seem to make life any better. In fact, life frequently becomes worse as a result of their actions. So we're in this spiral which doesn't take anyone to a better place.
Do you think the investigation by the British government into the Muslim Brotherhood activities, whether they relate to terrorism or not, would you think that this will yield something significant or yield something solid?
Well, it might. I'm politically independent, as you know, and I'm not part of that investigation,
Sure.
and although I would read the results with some interest. The Muslim Brotherhood is not the only politically inspired group, of course, but it's politically important, of course, to Egypt, for reasons that we all understand. And the reason I think that the investigation is being carried out at the moment is to try and get a better understanding of just where the Brotherhood actually does stand and what it does stand for, rather than perhaps a cursory view which some of the media in the UK have accorded it.
Right. Let me go back to the visits that you've had for quite a busy schedule in 2 days, and you've met with the president. You've met
Been
with
a packed schedule.
Yeah. Tell me first about impressions about meeting with President Sisi.
Well, I had not met him before. Some of my colleagues on this visit had met him before he became president.
Sure.
This was my first introduction to him, and I was very, very impressed. Very impressed indeed. He said the things that one would hope he would say, but there was a sincerity behind it. Trying to judge as we all do, the man behind the words, as it were. And he is obviously deeply sincere, deeply committed, and I believe he has an enormous will to see through the policy which he's recently outlined to the people of Egypt.
And with that sincerity that you sensed, of course you have concerns because you've met, for example, with the Human Rights Council before you had that meeting. So how did these conform together, or was the meeting with the Human Rights Council not significant?
Oh, it was significant. I mean, human rights in many countries in the Middle East and in Egypt as well is a big issue and has been for a long time. And the President, in his inaugural address, of course, addressed the issue of human rights very early on, almost up front, in what he had to say. And it's a truism, I think, that if you are going to combat terrorism, the nation concerned has to address its own human rights issues as well. Because terrorism tends to grow from within. Very rarely can it be imposed from outside. Of course it can come from outside. But usually the real threat is from within your own country.
That's the most difficult to fight.
Exactly. And if that is growing from within your own country because of dissatisfaction with the state, often with the police or with the security services or the army or whoever it is, then you have a tiger by the tail. And so human rights, quite apart from the need to treat people decently, which is obviously a paramount, there is another big payoff, that if you do it, you damp down the chances, reduce the chances of having terrorism growing within your own country.
But we know that there are people who have been dissatisfied with the government and the system of the government, and these are the ones who went out to the streets. But we know also that those who were behind terrorism were not part of these, but were part of people who wanted to take power in their own hands. And that's a little bit of a different story, because no matter how you improve human rights, this portion of the people will remain dissatisfied.
Of course. There's no simple quick fix to this. And nobody, certainly not I, am pretending that countering terrorism is an easy business. It's not. But you certainly start off with a much better chance if you address the human rights issues, because you've got to address them anyway. If you're going to have a decent, tolerant, sensible society with freedoms that we all understand and we all strive for, they've got to be in place first. You could argue that they've got to be in place even before you start to address issues of health and employment and infrastructure and education. Of course they're important.
And he spoke to you about these particular issues as being part of human rights.
Yes, that human rights are part of those as well. But you could advance the theory, I think. I would certainly advance the theory that the fundamental of all is a stable, sensitive, fair, properly organized structure within the country where people feel safe and people feel their rights are being protected. And then everything else can be grown on top of that.
Almost every other guest that comes to me on Cairo 360 cites the statement made by Mr. David Cameron: when it comes to national security, then human rights should take a step backwards, something to that sense.
Did he say that?
I guess so.
I don't remember him saying that, and I certainly would not subscribe to that. I think there is always a tension between countering terrorism and insurgency on the one hand, and protecting the individual rights on the other. Mm-hmm. But I think if as we say, push comes to shove, you have got to protect the human rights side of that argument. Mm-hmm. Because if you let it slip, you're on then a slippery slope downhill. The mechanics who might be listening to a program will know what I mean by the ratchet effect. You can wind up on a ratchet, but you never go back on it. Mm-hmm. And if you destroy or damage some aspect of human rights, strangely you can never recover it later. Mm-hmm. A politician who says, believe me, we will meddle with something, we will change something, and when we get the situation right, we'll go back to where we were before.
It never happens.
Never happens. Never happens. Mm-hmm. And so human rights, what we tend to shorthand in the UK as sort of Magna Carta principles. Magna Carta anniversary next year. 1215 has its anniversary next year. Mm-hmm. Those Magna Carta rights are very, very important and should not be tampered with.
Right. So, once again, I'd say, when you go back home, and how will you address other members of the House of Lords or Parliament or the media? What will you tell them about Egypt? What have you seen that has encouraged you, and what have you seen that has discouraged you?
I don't think I've seen anything to discourage me. I came well briefed, and I see that Egypt, of course, has huge problems. Nobody could argue with that. Unemployment is massive. The lack of inward investment, the lack of investors who've left this country before, education he's looking at, health, all of that. But the President knows about that. And there is a great sense that I have spotted in a very brief visit, 2 days or so. There's a great sense that grows from the President and all the others, ministers and others who we've spoken to, that the past is behind and the future beckons. And I don't think any of them expect a quick fix. They will want to score on some points fairly quickly. Of course they do. The first 100 days are important to a politician, of course. But they are moving into a new regime. There's no doubt about that. And I'm very heartened personally, that I believe that they have seen the sort of things that I applaud, and clearly they applaud as well. Egypt is a great country. It has had a great past. It has undoubtedly a great future. And I wish it luck.
You've met with the Minister of Defense, and we know that there is quite a part that is happening that is dependent on the Egyptian army, taking into consideration that many Arab armies have fallen apart in the past 10, 12, 13 years, ever since the invasion of Iraq, and then what followed in the past few years. Yeah. How do you see the role of the Egyptian army, both locally in Egypt and regionally?
Regionally, I think one would recognize that the Egyptian army is very well equipped and very well led and very well trained, and it is well respected. There is no doubt about that. The role that the army has been forced to play internally in dealing with internal problems, of course, is well known. And although it's for the President to decide, I would imagine, from what I've heard, that the army will tend to look more towards the protection of the external boundaries and allow the police to grow, the police to recast itself with due regard to human rights. This very difficult balance we talked about before, with law enforcement on the one hand and protecting human rights on the other. There will be an interface, of course, between the police and the army. There always is. And that interface will need to be worked out by the President and his advisors between the army and the police. If you like to use an expression, as the army moves out, the police will fill something of a gap, which the army
that may
previously...
be a bit difficult for the example of Sinai, for example.
Well, if you move out onto Sinai, and I'm not an expert on that part of the situation, but the army I would have thought would continue to play a very similar role in Sinai. But I was thinking more within Egypt itself.
Within the cities, the main cities.
Yes, within central Egypt.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I see the police taking a greater role. It's an area that I understand, policing I understand, and counterterrorism I understand. They will need to move forward from where they were to where they want to get, and there will be that interface with the army. But I would expect to see over the next 2 or 3 years or whatever that the army play a lesser role within the country itself, and perhaps a greater role in the wider Middle East.
A greater role in the Middle East.
Well, if they are not distracted is the wrong word, but if they're not preoccupied to the same extent internally, of course they can spread themselves more in terms of their influence. And the influence is something which is not for me to suggest. It's very much a matter for the president. But I go back to the point I made. The Egyptian army is a very well-trained, well-disciplined force. In army terms, a force to be reckoned with. And that is something which is not always present in the Middle East.
Yeah. You've met with many politicians, starting the president down to ministers and so on. Did you get a chance to meet with other normal citizens out on the street, or drivers? Or
no, well, drivers. Yeah, I'm a great believer in drivers. Taxi drivers in London are a fount of information, and I guess they probably are here too. No, it is one of the things that we have not done so much on this, or hardly at all on this visit, and I would hope to come back soon and have a chance to have more spare time and meet, as you put it, real people. But I remain impressed with the people I've met at governmental level.
Well, you'll have to make up for the many years you haven't visited Egypt by more frequent visits. But on behalf of regular Egyptian citizens, I'm thankful to you for taking the time and the pains of being here.
Asama, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
مجموعة اللقاءات اللي قدمتها لحضراتكم ممكن ما تكونش غطت كل أعضاء مجلس النواب وأعضاء العموم واللوردات اللي موجودين من بريطانيا، ولكن على الأقل تدينا انطباع الناس خرجت بإيه، هترجع بلدها تقول إيه عن مصر. احنا محتاجين مثل هذه الزيارات. يعني مرة تانية بشكر الأستاذ سمير تكلة اللي هو يعني واحد من الناس اللي نظموا هذه الرحلة، ومعاه رجل الأعمال المصري محمد فريد خميس اللي ساعدوا على أن الرحلة دي تحصل. والاستجابة اللي حصلت الحقيقة من الحكومة للقاءاتهم كانت استجابة أذهلتهم، أن الكثير من أعضاء الحكومة كانوا راغبين في أنهم يلتقوا بيهم ويشرحوا لهم وجهة نظر مصر. الكلام ده بيحصل على مستوى بريطانيا، زي ما قدمت لحضراتكم من حوالي شهر لما رحت بريطانيا والتقيت أعضاء مجلس نواب هناك وغيرهم. محتاجين ان ده يتكرر على مستوى البلاد الأخرى، على مستوى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، على مستوى فرنسا، ألمانيا، على مستوى بلاد في الشرق الأقصى، لأننا محتاجين ننقل صورة مصر وصوت مصر للخارج إذا كنا فعلا جادين في اننا نبني اقتصادنا الفترة اللي جاية ونواجه التحديات. الناس كلها شايفة في تحديات قدام مصر كبيرة جدا، لكن زي ما سمعتم من ضيوفنا النهاردة ان كلهم عندهم امل ان الفترة اللي جاية هم متفائلين بيها انها تحقق للشعب المصري اللي هو عايزه، لان ده بالتالي هينعكس عليهم هم في اعمالهم وفي استثماراتهم.